Hi everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the issue in the book of Acts from chapter 16 verses 16 to 19 and ask the question, why does Luke include the story of Paul's embarrassing delay for many days to exorcise a demon from the Python Priestess at Philippi? So for many days she's endorsing his, quote, message of salvation, and yet he does nothing. Then at the end of that, he decides he better stop her. Obviously, he realized people were putting two and two together. A demon is endorsing his message. So we're going to look at why would Luke include that story in the book of Acts? And then we will ask, will or could the number two here on this list. So the first one is, why did he do that? Did that happen? Two, why did Luke include the story? Could the Python Priestess as an endorsement play a key factor in acquittal by Nero? So in the end of this, we're going to see that obviously why he put it in there was not for Christians to read, because we would be shocked that he did nothing for days and accepted the endorsement of a demon, that his gospel was endorsed by a demon, and the most important demon of the world, the political world of that era, as we're going to see. She's not a nobody. Many women served this role of Python priestesses. Only a few probably really were completely demonic and have prophecy through demonic spirits, and she was one of them because she earned a lot of money for her masters. Anyway, so then number three, I will ask, what does God want us to learn from the Python story? So even though Luke did not intend this book for us, what does God intend us to do with this information that Paul was indeed endorsed with demons, by demons? So Luke is using the story to help in the defense at the trial upcoming in Rome, where Paul is on trial, going to be on trial soon, for his friend Trophimus violating the temple by going in an uncircumcised state. So, but why does God want us to know about this story, and how will it help us be closer to God? All right, we'll see. Okay, so first we're just going to go over what we did in the prior video a little bit. Here's the Ebionites, are the early church, and we're going to just review that because they came up with the determination that Paul was guilty of apostasy. They suspected he was guilty of apostasy, and then they found him guilty eventually. So we need to know about that because that gives us a little background of what or why they would have wanted this story to be in there, for purposes of maybe Christians knowing about it, but not in a positive way, not thinking this is a proof that Paul is an apostle or anything like that. Anyway, we'll see how that can fit in. In Philip Schaff's work, or edited work, Olharn wrote an article called Ebionites, and it says at page 684, the designation Ebionites was at first, like Nazarenes, a common name for all Christians, as Epiphanius testifies. It is derived from the Hebrew word Ebion, or the poor. Now, who led the poor at Jerusalem? Well, Paul refers to them in Galatians 2:9 and calls them the poor. James, Cephas, another name for Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, they desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I also was eager to do. And Jerome said that because he knew in Hebrew the word poor was Ebion, he said that's Paul's just using a Greek word for what they were known as. And so Jerome, what historians concur about this is that Stephen Cooper, Marius Victorinus, commentary on Galatians, says Jerome's more historically correct reading for whom the poor here in Galatians 2:9 means that they are the Jewish believers of Acts 2:44 to 45, and that means they're led by James, Peter, and John. So the Ebionites were led by those three. Then in 180 AD, Irenaeus records the Ebionites repudiate Paul. This is a quote: "Those who are called Ebionites use the gospel according to Matthew only and repudiate the apostle Paul, maintaining that he was an apostate from the law." Then when we go to Acts 21, we see that James, when he confronts Paul about this issue, he actually uses the word apostasia as translated or used in Acts 21:21. So James, the head bishop of the Jerusalem church, the head of what would be called the Ebion, he says to Paul, "But they, the apostles, have heard or were told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses." That's how it is often translated, but it really should be apostatize against Moses. And you can see there in the Greek, it's apostasia, telling them not to circumcise their children and not to walk according to our customs. Okay, so it's not a coincidence that we see a record of James, the head of the church, in Acts, asking the very question about apostasy, which is ultimately what the Ebionites concluded was true of Paul. We also have another validation that that's actually what the apostles did because of somebody's commentary, as if it was just a known fact. Ambrosiaster says this in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, that Paul was rejected as an apostle by the other apostles, by the actual apostles. And he writes, "Those Jewish believers who nevertheless continued to observe the law of Moses denied that Paul was an apostle because he taught that it was no longer necessary to be circumcised or observe the Sabbath. Even the other apostles thought that he was teaching something different because of this, and they denied that he was an apostle. But to the Corinthians, Paul was an apostle because they had seen the signs of God's power in him." So they were relying upon what? Signs and wonders. We're going to see what God thinks if you rely on signs and wonders to excuse someone who is apostatizing against God's law to Israel, or to some extent it does also apply to Gentiles, particularly Sabbath. Further, Irenaeus wrote in 180 AD that the Ebionites accepted Luke's gospel, but they reject the book of Acts. And we're seeing why, because it was not directly meant for us, or at least they didn't want us to accept it as authority, that we would view the clear, obvious effort to try to put Paul in the best light possible for the intended audience. But the intended audience wasn't us. It was for the Roman pagans who were going to try Paul shortly, and that's why Luke is putting together these documents to try to help win that case. So anyway, so what does he say? Irenaeus writes that the Ebionites, quote, "do not recognize Paul as an apostle, but make use of the gospel we have come to know through Luke, but they reject the book of Acts." And so now we can see why. There's nothing wrong with Luke's gospel, but the book of Acts was not intended for us to make us think the way Luke was trying to make the pagans think. Okay, so now we're going to get to the key issue here. The Python Priestess of Acts 16, verses 16 to 19 at Philippi, who endorsed Paul for many days, is finally exorcised by the end of this passage. Okay, so this is a picture of her sitting on what's called a tripod, and we'll get into that in a minute. This is how she would do divination. So something she's sitting on is somehow passing through into her body and making her divine prophecies, and basically mumble and speak garrulously, and nobody can understand her, but somebody translates what she's saying on paper. Some other priest can understand her. So why did Luke include the story? Because it would make, if she endorses Paul, which she's going to do, she's going to endorse Paul's message of salvation, not Jesus, but the message of salvation brought by Paul. And so this would be intended to make pagans identify positively for Paul, because you'll see, she is the most important figure, like a rock star of that era. If she, and there are many of them, you have to understand they're all working as a team, if one of them endorses him and she's demonic, this is what the Gentile pagans loved. Whatever she said, they would then rally to that person based on her endorsement. Okay, but we need to understand, why would God put the story in there and leave it there for us to see, even though this book of Acts was not meant for us, is because it lets us test Paul. That's why God let us see this, and that's why it's not gone. Basically, Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 13:1-10 in Matthew 7:21-23, and nobody wants to acknowledge that, but you'll see why it's so. And what this is Deuteronomy 13:1-10 is called the apostasy rule of the law. So it means you can have signs and wonders, but if you're trying to seduce people from following God, from not obeying His commandments, you are considered an apostate. And it uses that word in the Greek translation. So I'll just I'm not going to read every word of it here, but if there arise among you a prophet and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or wonder comes to pass, whereof he spake to you, saying, let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet. For the Lord your God proves you to know whether you love the Lord your God with your whole heart and with all your soul. Now, Jesus actually referred to this as the greatest commandment. That's in another context. Well, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord God, your God with your whole heart and soul. And here is these words. And how do you prove that? Oh, you prove it by looking at a prophet who has signs and wonders, and you think they're miraculously done by God's power, but you don't test their message? No, he proves you by you testing his message. And anyway, what's some of the factors that go against someone? You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him and keep his commandments and obey his voice. So you're not supposed to let him or her seduce you from following Yahweh, and you shall serve him, Yahweh, and cleave unto him, and that prophet shall be put to death. I mean, this is a death penalty, because he has spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God. So that's another kind of apostasy. Verse 10, and thou shalt stone him with stones that he die, because he has sought to thrust you away. The word is translated into the Greek Septuagint Bible by the word apostasai. Okay, and it's translated there as to abstain. It's to make you turn away, apostatize. And that's in the interlinear Greek English Septuagint Old Testament. You can just search on that and it'll come up. Jesus says the same identical thing, but a lot of people don't see it. Not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father, which is in heaven. So what is that? Oh, keeps his commandments. That's the will of God. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and in your name cast out devils, and in your name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work anomia, which is translated typically, KJV is an example, as iniquity. But the actual meaning of the word here is apostasy. Let me prove that to you. So the Greek word anomia in the Bible sometimes has the meaning of apostasy, especially similar to Isaiah 1:5. So, for example, this is from Rose's lexicon, and you'll see it here. Schluser thinks that in 2 Thessalonians 2:7 has the meaning of apostasy, referring to Job 7:21, 8:4, and especially in Isaiah 1:5, and in 2 Corinthians, absolutely. So why would we say it? You can just see this is the structure of the exact same wording in Deuteronomy 13:1-10, which is you have signs and wonders, people doing miracles and prophesying wonderful works. You've done many wonderful works. You've cast out devils. You have signs and wonders, but you are trying to do something. You are working anomia, which is apostasy, and clearly in Isaiah 1:5 in the Greek Septuagint translation and other places. And also, I think I just showed you that in Deuteronomy 13:10, it did translate in verse 10 the words about pulling you away as the word apostasai. So you see, it is already in Deuteronomy 13:10. So that's what Jesus is referring to. Now, the problem most people have with this is, well, why would God send us Paul to make us be put under a test? Well, why would he mislead us is basically what people are saying. Why would he allow it? Okay, that's really the first question. And don't blame God if Satan is using somebody and we're not paying attention to the test. So this is so in other words, the heading here is, why does God allow evil men to do miracles? To test whether you truly love God. Now, this is how it's explained in the commentary of Vincensis Lyrinensis concerning the rule of faith. This is in a book called The Apologies of Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Minucius Felix. I wouldn't want to have that as first name. And 1709, volume 2, beginning at 223. And this is what he says regarding this. But why then, I beseech you, this is on the right side of this, why then, I beseech you, does God permit the preaching of that which he will not have followed? So in other words, why does he allow people to say and preach things that he doesn't want people to follow? Because he says, the Lord your God proves you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. the number one command. How does God test us on the number one command? He tells us expressly how he does it. And it's going to be false teachers who seem really righteous, they're saying all the right things, but they're off. They're teaching something contrary to God's word. Anyway, it says here, and a great and powerful proof without doubt it is when he who you look upon is a prophet or a disciple of prophets or a doctor and zealous stickler for the truth. When I say whom you exceedingly revere and love privily, drops his baneful errors and so slyly mixes them with truth that whilst you are blinded with the authority of the deceiver, you cannot presently perceive the deceit, and 'tis very hard to condemn the doctrine when you admire the doctor. Wow, what a very truthful statement. So in other words, if you fall in love with someone's teaching or doctrine and you just willfully ignore the fact that this person is speaking contrary to God's word beforehand, as I showed you in the last video, Paul, for example, says God does not live in temples made of human hands. This is on the Temple Mount, the Mars Hill speech. Go read that. God lives in a temple. At the time he says this, God lived in a temple made of human hands. Nothing could be more contradictory to God's word than to depict God opposite of the way he really is. So obviously Luke is not including that story for us to not see it. He's thinking this is good for the Roman judge, magistrate, Theophilus to read, because he's going to side or sympathize, because in Roman and Greek pagan religion, the gods don't live in temples. They live at Mount Olympus. They visit the temples from time to time, but they don't live there. And so they were always puzzled, why do the Jews care about an uncircumcised Gentile going into a temple? Because basically, for their view, it's like God doesn't live there, but that's what the Jews think. So, we'll enforce their laws, but they don't want to do that because it doesn't fit their religion. Anyway, so this is the point. God allows this problem to exist so we are tested and prove our love of God. Or do we love the opinion of men? Or, you're going to be attacked, criticized, faulted, hated, whatever, because you don't accept Paul and you just want to follow Jesus. That's what's going on in our world today. Okay, next. Okay, so again, this is the Python priestess picture. It's from a German artist, Heinrich Lutman, and she's basically sitting on a tripod. If you can see, there's 3 separate little metallic legs that's coming out, and that's how she communicates and gets supposedly divine messages, okay? Now we need a little more background. The Python, this is in Rick Straylin's Strange Acts, Studies in the Cultural World of the Acts of the Apostles. The Python in Greek mythology was the serpent who guarded the Delphic oral. Apollo's prophetic seer was called Pythia. So she's Python Pythia. Now Apollo is the god of the sun, so she's an agent of his. And there's a whole background the pagans had about how that relationship came about. And then Mr. Howie, well, I'll say Howie, the encircled serpent in Serpent, a study of serpent symbolism in all countries, 1900. He writes, the Pythonist, the young virgin who would speak the serpent's prophecies, had to sit on the tripod at the Temple of Python Apollo at Delphi. Eventually, there were always 3 young virgins who would alternate at the task. So we'll see, though, later, Philip of Macedon, to become leader of the country, basically co-opted one of these priestesses and brought her to Philippi, and she starts prophesying in his favor. So that's how it ends up at Philippi, where Paul will meet one of these prophetesses. All right, and now we'll discuss how Philip of Macedon co-opted this priestess. Delphos of Greece. So maybe you've already heard of the Oracle of Delphi. Well, that's this Python priestess. Delphos of Greece and its oracle became linked to Philippi and Macedon because in the 300s BC, Macedon under Philip II seized parts of Greece by bribing the Python oracle to give prophecies of his success. It was said by Demosthenes that the oracle had become Philippized. And this is at the prior book at page 146. But please notice how absolutely influential this woman was. If she said somebody should be accepted, revered, honored, believed, then you would accept her if you're a pagan because she's in touch with the gods. So that's how significant it was when Paul gets her endorsement. Okay, and I want to show you a dialogue going on between Origen and Celsus in about 248 AD. Now it's about the Python Priestess, and just by this context you can understand that when this lady gave prophecies, her prophecies go all over Europe. And so these two people are in totally different countries, and Origen and Celsus are able to communicate in common about things that this woman says. So anyway, Origen in 248 AD was debating with Celsus on what inspiration truly means, and Celsus is basically pagan mindset. He goes, there's not only one God, instead there are many gods, and hence many inspired prophets. Celsus cited specifically, quote, the oracles of the Python Priestess as unjustly being ignored as inspired by Origen. In response, Origen wrote Celsus, and in the responses of the Pythian oracle, also you may find some injunctions which you may find are not in accordance with reason, two of which we shall adduce on the present occasion. So he's already discussed one, I'll skip it. Two, when the Python priestess called Archilochus, the servant of the Muses, a man who employed his poetic powers upon topics of the most wicked and licentious nature, and whose public character was dissolute and impure, and entitled him pious in respect of his being a servant of the Muses, who are deemed to be goddesses. Now I am inclined that no one would assert he was a pious man, but let it be granted the responses by the Pythian were not false pretensions of the inspiration, but on the other hand, they may be traced to wicked demons. So in other words, the reason she's endorsing the Pythian priestess is endorsing this man Archilochus, who's so evil, is a proof that she's demonic. And now just put your hats on, gentlemen, ladies, is what does that mean if you think about Paul and the same Python priestess endorsed him? It's a reflection that means wicked demons are making her endorse Paul. And God is helping us here to put 2 and 2 together. Pretty obvious though, but we have to go step by step, and here we are. Evidence again that there's a real problem with Paul. So now let's get into Paul at Philippi. First thing we need to know is how does Paul operate in those visits. So just before that, he's at Lystra, and the people of Lystra had decided that Barnabas was the Greek god Zeus and that Paul was Hermes, since Paul was the chief speaker. So he's basically the leader when he goes into each city, and we'll see how he's revered when he gets to see the Python priestess. First, we have to establish that he's there in Philippi. So in verse 12 of chapter 16, Luke says, thence also Paul, and by the way, Luke is in his company, went to Philippi, which is a principal city of the part of Macedonia, a colony, and we were in this city abiding certain days. And then he records in verses 16 and 17, and it came to pass in our going on to prayer, a certain maid having the spirit of Python did meet us, who brought much employment to her masters by soothsaying of the future. Basically, she, having followed Paul and us, was crying, saying, these men are servants of the Most High, who declare to us a way of salvation. By the way, what people would have understood she's saying is not he's the servant of Yahweh. The Most High God was Zeus. So this statement she's making, and we're going to be repeating for days, is something that Paul should have corrected immediately, but he does nothing. But he's getting advantage because who's the number one voice in all of Europe? Whatever this woman says, in whatever body she's operating, among the many women who rotated the jobs, this is all to Paul's great advantage to have her doing this. Okay, so now we're going to read verse 18. And this she was doing, declaring he had a way of salvation this entire time. She was doing for many days. But Paul, having been grieved and having turned, said to the Spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come forth from her. And it came forth the same hour. So anyway, it was many days he was tolerating what she was doing. He was getting great advantage because, again, this is the most important, most influential voice you could possibly get in the pagan world. And so he took full advantage of it, but he obviously became grieved probably thinking that people are going to start wondering if my message isn't, why is it being endorsed by demons? So he didn't do this initially when he should have, and also she was making it sound like he's an agent of Zeus, the Most High God, who is not Yahweh. So it's from the people who would hear what she was saying. So that's another very serious problem for Paul. That it wouldn't nobody would have identified that meant he was an agent of Yahweh. Just want to discuss really quickly the manuscript evidence, because you'll find sometimes this is not in every translation, this word Python. In the Greek text, down here is Gill's exposition of the Bible. He's a reformed expositor of the Bible, very reliable. In the Greek text, it is the Spirit of Python. The Alexandrian copy and the Vulgate Latin version read the Spirit of Python. Alexandrian text is considered one of the most authoritative lines of biblical New Testament text, so that's why we should expect it would be correct. And also, it was present in the Latin Vulgate, which often is a good way of double-checking things. I want to also notice that a pastor looked at this in the Berean Bible Church, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, and he noticed this, and he did some good research on it, but he didn't see the same problem I do. We'll see what he thought. So he says the literal Greek reads, she had a spirit of Python. That's the same term as a python snake. Okay, and this pastor's continuing. By the way, his name is Pastor David B. Curtis, delivered on 9/20/2009 at the Berean Bible Church. And he says the demon, Greek pneuma pathona, with her knew of Paul. The demon within her knew of Paul and announced through her who he was and what he was doing. Okay, I just want to do a little footnote here. Is you can see here in the Greek it's pneuma pathona, and you can find a link to where that is in the New Testament in its original Greek by the editors Westcott Hort, 1885. You can find that through going to the link to Perseus Tuft, Book of Acts 16, verse 16. And if you do a little digging and you want to find out what lines of text traditions have this, it's in the Greek text. It's the Spirit of Python, according to Gill exposition of the Bible. It's in the Alexandrian copy, meaning that line, the Alexandrian line, and the Vulgate Latin version. So those are basically some of our oldest lines. So that's considered authoritative. That's the way it must have read much earlier. Okay, so anyway, that's where that comes from. So we're going back to the article by the pastor, and by the way, the article is called "Paul Exercises the Python." That's how you would look it up on the internet. This referred to the legendary snake in Greek mythology that guarded the Delphic oracle in central Greece. So again, this is the oracle of Delphi. Very, you might know of her that way, the Delphic oracle or the oracle of Delphi. But remember, she had a second location based on Philip bribing her to come into Macedon and prophesy in his favor. So Pastor Curtis continues. Apollo supposedly killed this snake, and the snake's spirit dwelled in the priestess there. So he understands she's a priestess. The pastor continues. So a python spirit referred to a spirit that enabled someone to predict the future. Such people generally spoke with the mouth closed, uttering words completely out of their control. So this was spontaneous speaking, garrulous glossalia. Basically, you couldn't understand a thing they were saying, and yet they would have an interpreter. Priest would then write the translation down of what they said. So you wouldn't really understand what they were saying most of the time. And Pastor Curtis is blunt. It seems that the slave girl could really see into the future, and so her owners earned money from her. But the power came from Satan by an evil spirit. This girl was possessed by a demon. That's actually the problem for Paul. Why did you do nothing for many days? Why did you accept her endorsement? Why? Because he was getting more popular every day, obviously. All right, going back to Acts 16:17, what's she saying? The same, this Python priestess following after Paul and us cried out, saying, These men are servants of the Most High God, that's Zeus, who proclaim unto you the or a way of salvation. It's in the footnote in the ASV. Most translated, I think, as a way of salvation, because that's what it sounds like. Okay, anyway, not material. Now, Pastor Curtis wants to give Paul a pass on this, that it didn't matter that he waited many days to do this at all. It's just like what Jesus did. So here's what he says. Paul's response was the same as the response which Jesus made to the possessed man in the synagogue at Capernaum. This man had said to the Lord, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. So that's supposedly the same. However, we're going to now test Pastor Curtis. Why the key issue is Paul is tolerating for many days the most influential demon on earth's endorsement. That's in verse 18. She did this for many days, endorsing him as having a way of salvation. Now let's compare and contrast this with what the pastor is referring to. He's basically referred to this passage, Mark 1, verses 21 to 26. And does Jesus wait? Many, accept this endorsement by a demon. And was this going to help him to do that? Anyway, verse 21. And they go into Capernaum, and straightway on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as having authority and not as the scribes. And straightway there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, What have we to do with thee, Jesus, thou Nazarene? Art thou come to destroy us? I know you, who thou art, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, Hold thy peace. So basically, shut up. I don't mean that he would have used those harsh words. Hold thy peace, and come out of him. And the unclean spirit, tearing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. So Jesus does this completely different than Paul, right? He does not wait. He immediately stops this statement about him from a demon. So we see completely opposite reaction here. Paul enjoys the demon's endorsement for many days, great advantage because his particular demon was very helpful and influential. Jesus immediately rebukes the demon. Very significant difference. Therefore, you cannot compare what Paul did to what Jesus did at all. They're not at all alike. Okay, we're just going to look at some little point here before we get to the conclusion about how to interpret what went on with the Python Priestess. Just so we know, is the name for the Python Priestess is also in the book of Samuel, and she's indirectly referred to in Revelation 9:11. So just so we see, the Comte de Lude wrote a book called Demonologia, or Treatise of Spirits, in 1723. If you look to the right and you see the crop of the face page, he's a presbyter of the Church of England. And he said, 1 Samuel 28:7 says, Lo, a woman possessing a familiar spirit in Endor. That's its typical translation. He says there's something being missed. And he says the Hebrew word is OBH in Hebrew, and that's spirit of Python. It also turns out that OBH is just a condensed form of the word in Hebrew of Abaddon, and Abaddon is referred to in the book of Revelation. Book of Revelation 9:11 describes the king over the locusts tormenting those in the bottomless pit in verse 11. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit. So this is an angel, the Abaddon or OBH, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, or what? Python. This angel can also be referred to as the Python. So if this Python priestess spoke, maybe what God is revealing to us is that there's an angel of the bottomless pit who speaks through her, and that's called Abaddon. But in the Greek tongue has this name, Apollyon, which means of Apollo, which the Python priestess was of Apollo. So there is some basis to believe that God is telling us multiple times this Python priestess is an important figure in the end times as well. Okay, and we're going to wrap up pretty quickly, hopefully. Luke intended his intended audience are pagan investigators for the trial before Nero. So I think in the prior video we saw that, because Paul is on trial for allegedly his companion from Ephesus going into the temple uncircumcised, and that led to an uproar, and Paul's arrest, and so on. And we'll get into a little bit of those details. So Mark in 2001 was an attorney, wrote a book, Paul on Trial. You see it's referenced there on the page. The book of Acts as a defense of Christianity. So this is why Luke is writing the book, not to get our to make us think, oh, hey, Paul's a great guy because he's the focus of this. Yes, it is a defense of him, but not to us. The things being revealed, such as the Python Priestess, is only going to appeal to the pagans. It shouldn't make us feel good that Paul sat around many days accepting her endorsement when she's a demon and endorsing his way of salvation rather than Jesus specifically. Anyway, here's what he says. Luke Acts was written as a legal defense of Paul as he awaited trial before Nero and was intended to bring the gospel to Theophilus even as he gathered facts concerning the charges against Paul. So that's true. The Gospel of Luke had a more broad purpose to maybe even evangelize Theophilus, give him also a positive view of the Christian Ebion movement, and that might help him to also be more persuaded to treat our case with more serious attention. He's a magistrate at Rome. He's obviously helping here. He's obviously going to maybe be the background person to talk to Nero about how to handle this case. Who we don't exactly know that, but that was the early church's view, and that's I'll explain that in the next slide. Okay, so what Mr. Mock did is he revived the same thing that had been revived one time before in 1720. This was known as the traditional view of why Luke wrote Acts and how it was being used by the church. The book of Acts, by the way, does not come into public view, meaning like nobody's quoting it or citing it for until like the middle of the 100s, like 150 to 180 AD. So that kind of tells right there that this is not a book that was intended for circulation to the general Christian populace, or else it would have been frequently cited at some point until that mid-century point. Anyway, earlier, this view was restored in 1720 by C.A. Human in his article, De Sartartio de Theophilo, so on and so forth. And in there, he argues that Luke wrote to the Roman magistrate Theophilus to defend against false accusations against Christianity. So that shows you that Mark didn't just come up with this idea on his own. It's been there for forever, since the very beginning of Christianity, why that was written. Okay, so the next point I want to make is Luke's intended audiences are the pagan investigators for trial before Nero. And what was going on there are crucial issues to the survival of Christianity. So here's the remarks I want to point out. The issue on appeal to Caesar was whether Paul brought Trophimus in an uncircumcised state inside the temple in the sacred area. If Paul lost, Christianity could have been viewed as authorizing an act of defilement of the Temple of Judaism, and Nero could strip Christianity of its legal right to operate under Judaism's official recognition as a religion approved by Rome. So many modern Christians are not aware that at the time of the book of Acts, and even in the time of Jesus, Judaism was an authorized or legal religion in Rome. If you're an illegal religion, you're not allowed to operate. Not allowed to proselyte, not allowed to hold meetings, nothing. So losing legal recognition would be destructive of Christ's movement. So the initial church, James, the brother of Jesus, as bishop, Peter and John in particular, their leaders, they're going to come to the defense of Paul because they have to. In other words, they cannot afford him to lose. And if Paul is found guilty, they also have to have ways of countering that problem. But they, first of all, and the best thing is if Paul can be found not guilty, and that's the aim of Luke. And so he's trying to bring out facts that are helpful for defense, and that's clearly the defense that he was not. That he was promoted by the Python Priestess, who is famous through Europe. And so if she says he's okay, he should be okay to any pagan. Okay, and just to remind you what's going on in that trial, why this is so important is there was no dispute that Trophimus, the companion of Paul from Ephesus, did violate the temple. That's in Acts 21. Maybe, just so you know, violated it by going through what's called the wall at the temple where the Gentiles were told you can't go past this place if you're uncircumcised. And there was a little sign that gave a death penalty instruction in Greek, Latin, and and Hebrew. If you pass this point, you're going to be subject to the death penalty. So that's what happened, is that Trophimus went past that point. And if you read the book of Ephesians to the Ephesians, and Trophimus, one of them, it says the middle wall of separation at the temple is no longer there. It's been taken away by Christ. And so, and circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. So he went through there thinking, I'm okay. But Paul was, well, we'll see where Paul was. Okay, so where was Paul? Paul's testimony was that he was in a ceremonial washing at the time Trophimus, his traveling companion from Ephesus, violated the temple. Luke preserves that. This is key to get Paul acquitted. For as mentioned above, Paul said his accusers merely found him, Paul, purifying himself in the temple. Acts 24:18. This was Paul's sole defense why he was not responsible for Trophimus' profaning the temple. See Acts 21, verse 28. Paul brought Greeks, quote, brought Greeks also into the temple and defiled this holy place. That's what they charged him with. And he had a good defense, which is, I wasn't even, when you found me, I wasn't even with him. So get off my back. So Luke is preserving those defenses for the Theophilus, the magistrate in Rome, to help the Christians not be found, or at least have Paul not be found guilty, and hopefully that would mean we wouldn't be found responsible for whatever happened. Christians wouldn't be found responsible. Now, the good news for Christianity is that Luke succeeded. Nero acquits Paul. And because there's a lot of controversy over this, I'm putting in this authority so you can see this. Eusebius and Jerome both record that Paul was acquitted by Nero in this trial. Eusebius makes it emphatic that Paul was, quote, absolved of all crime. Eusebius' Ecclesiastical Histories at page 62, book 2, chapter 12. So that's an unquestionable fact. There was a movie that came out called A Polite Bribe that didn't get this straight and thought that James was somehow trying to get Paul killed through the arrest at the temple for Trophimus' act, and then ultimately became the murderer of Paul because of doing that setup, and all of that depends upon his ignorance. The person who prepared that movie did not know that ultimate fact, which was Paul did not get convicted in that case. All right, so we're going to get to our conclusion, and then I'm going to have a little bonus material. So the conclusion is that Acts is a legal defense of Paul. It's not intended to make Christians think well of Paul. It's not intended, it is intended instead to make pagans judging his case relate to Paul. It is huge that Paul's gospel is endorsed by the Python Priestess. This alone could have been determinative of the trial before Paul. And when you combine it with what we saw in the last video about Paul's statements at the Mars Hill, where he says that God does not dwell in a temple made of human hands, that's clearly biblically false, right? Because Jesus said that my Father dwells at the temple, and he says in Mark 12:48, he says the temple was made of human hands. So biblically what he said was false, but it would completely resonate with pagans, because in pagan, Greek, and Roman religion, the gods don't live in temples of anything, of human hands or otherwise. They live at Mount Olympus. They'll visit for ceremonies and stuff like that at a temple, but they are not physically really present, and they don't live there at all times. So the Romans are probably also, wondering, here's a guy who's accused of bringing someone into the temple uncircumcised, and this man's telling us God doesn't even live there. So they've already been prepared to say this is not a big deal. The Jews are making a lot of nothing, and this man's telling us authoritatively, as a Pharisee, as a leader of their religion, that he can emphatically state God does not live in that temple of human hands. So that could have been exactly what happened at the trial. That fact could have been repeated at trial in front of Nero, plus it would come out or be discussed internally is that, hey, this guy was endorsed by the Python Priestess, the oracle that made Philip king of parts of Greece, by her coming out and saying he should be ruler, basically, or he should win. So that these two facts, and probably at least the Python Priestess alone, would have been sufficient for them to decide, hey, we're not going to go against this guy if this woman says he has a way of salvation. So whatever it is, we're not going to convict this guy. He's got too high an authority protecting him, and that's the Python Priestess, and she's just a voice for Apollo, and he's the god of the sun. So these are mostly sun worshippers, and therefore they want to protect and defend any reputation of the God of the sun. So anyway, that's how I would say this is clearly got to be probably the most important factor, and the secondary factor was Paul's speech at Mars Hill, that God doesn't really live in a temple of human hands. So you know what? Whatever Trophimus did, no big deal. There was no one in there that he offended at all. And that would appeal to Romans because that's their own religious view of whether God lives in a temple or not. Okay, so now I want to share with you something that was written by Mr. Wordsworth, the Canon of Westminster. So now he's a religious figure. He devotes his life to Christianity. Written in his book called The New Testament of Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the original Greek. Okay, so it's a commentary on Greek, and it's written in 1862. This is at page 120, and then he's going to talk about the important fact that the Python is mentioned by Luke, and he's saying specifically it would have been instantly recognized by the Roman court, basically at Rome. Okay, but he never puts two and two together. A remarkable expression, Python Priestess. The damsel was possessed by an evil spirit, the Python spirit, a word never occurring in the Gospels. The word Python would sound a note strong on the Greek and Roman ear. How much was contained in those words? Python was the prophetic serpent at Delphi, the center and focus of Gentile divination. Stop there. The center of Gentile divination, okay, at Delphi. Okay, but that's how her name would resonate to the persons reading this, and they realize, okay, this is in Philippi. That's because Philip of Macedon co-opted her and brought her there, another one of them there, or then did the same thing where they circulate several women doing the same job. The Python gave his name and place to the prophetic deity of the Gentile world. Okay. The successor of the serpent of Delphi was the Pythian Phobos, or Apollo, and from him all who claimed the powers of divination received their title and were called Pythons. The author then provides numerous examples from Greek literature. So this is absolutely proven by him by reference to all these Greek authors. Therefore, this damsel at Philippi with her Pythonistic possession was, according to her degree, a representative of Pythia who sat on the tripod of Delphi, and who delivered the responses in the name of Pythian Apollo, the successor of the serpent. I mean, he's taking time here to go through the religious views of this, so this is why. But she's called sometimes the Apollo Pythia or Pythia Apollo, and so it's emblematic. When you say the word Python, people start immediately thinking of Apollo. That's what he's trying to tell you. And brought much gain and renown to her masters at that place, and deceived the world by her sorcery. So this is a deceiving spirit, liar, or basically misleader. Okay, hence St. Luke calls the spirit at Philippi Python. The Python was an agent of Satan. So now we know why God wanted this in the book of Acts. It wasn't so much, I mean, Luke wanted it in there for the aim of getting Paul exonerated at this trial at Rome, but why would God want this? Because it aids us to pass the test of whether we love God with our whole mind, spirit, and strength, because it lets us see that Paul did not react the way Jesus did. He didn't rebuke her immediately. He accepted the most influential demonic spirit in the world, to endorse him and let his popularity grow at Philippi for many, many days. Never should have happened. Should have stopped it right away, just as Jesus would have done. You don't take that kind of advantage from a demon, and yet he did. And he did a sign and wonder. And that seems to be how many Christians judge. Well, he cast the demon out, so he must know God. But Jesus said no, Matthew 7:21, verses 23. So I hope that tells us how to put this in perspective. The book of Acts is written for pagan people. However, there are certain things that we can learn and use to test biblically whether we should accept Paul as a voice, an inspired voice, to tell us how to live and how to accept or understand Jesus at all. If he's being endorsed by demons, that's a strong voice. That's a test for us to know that God's helping us. He's giving us something that will help us make this decision easier for us to understand, and takes a little time and effort to think about. And God will bless you when you make this step. What is the step? The step is to move closer to Christ rather than further away. The effect of Paulinism in our world today is that people have walked away from Christ in a dispensational doctrine that everything Jesus said is really defunct, and everything he says it's of any hard, costly gospel is always gotten rid of. Sheep and the goats. The sheep go to heaven, the goats don't. They both call Jesus Lord. One does charity for the brethren, the other doesn't. And they make every kind of excuse that was for a different dispensation. They do that with so many other of Jesus' statements. And so we have to restore the strength of will to follow Jesus. And one of those is to look at something like the Python Priestess and say, okay, this is good proof. Say, why did Paul accept this demon's support for so many days? Jesus would have stopped it right away. He didn't. Why did he not do that? Isn't that some help for us to make this decision that we need to follow just what Jesus teaches and no longer dismiss what he says to a different dispensation? All right. I hope that helped everybody. I hope the Lord's blessed you today, and that this message will help you live closer to Christ, closer to Yahweh, and will bless you and hopefully others who see this video. God bless you. Amen.